We must not let history repeat itself. These calls to be dragged back into a war in Iraq must be rejected, because the reality is there's no military solution in Iraq.
Since 1991, 4 U.S. presidents have ordered military operations in Iraq, and multiple elected Congresses have authorized those operations, or at least generally allowed them to proceed. We know that history, and it's a big reason why the nation is so war-weary today. And while politicians often prove more hawkish than their constituents, lately even the Republican-led House arrived at what may be its most skeptical position on Iraq ever. Just last month, the House passed a resolution designed to slow any march back into that country. The bill required the president to get approval from Congress before sending any new combat troops to Iraq. That line in the sand drew huge bipartisan support, 370 to just 40. Now, that is a long way from 2002, when the House voted by 296 to 133 to authorize President Bush to go to Iraq and go to war. Support was even higher there in the Senate, with 77 votes for war. Now, let's be clear. The president did not declare war yesterday. He did not call for regime change. And as I've mentioned earlier in my discussion with Governor Dean, this president has a lot more credibility and consistency on the issue of Iraq than most politicians. But there's a but here. The question does remain, and it's one worth asking. With skepticism of Iraqi intervention at an all-time high, why are we heading back towards some kind of larger military role in that nation? Joining me now is Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a Democrat from California. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm glad to be with you.
Glad to have you. Let me start with that question. Why are we headed back?
Well, let's hope that we're not headed back. I mean, the president laid it out very clearly last night. One is that there's a very, very serious issue right now as it relates to genocide that could be perpetrated. And so we're there, as the president said, to prevent a horrific act, which could be an act of genocide. Secondly, we have United States personnel there. And part of the military strategy now is to ensure that our personnel are protected and secured. So it's very limited and it's targeted. Anything beyond that, let me tell you, the president should come to Congress and debate it. And you mentioned the resolution before, Congressman McGovern, Congressman Jones, myself. It is no sentiment, I think, in our country to go back in a combat role in Iraq. And so
Congresswoman, let me ask you then,
the president said that last night.
And yes, and you've been clear on that. Does your resolution do anything in your view that would limit this particular set of operations at any point?
Yes, I think what it does is, because certainly, first of all, mission creep could happen. This could be expanded into a broader conflict. I think this resolution very clearly says that any expansion of military, especially as it relates to combat troops, the president would be required to come to Congress. But I also have to say that last night, and I listened to the president's speech very clearly, he very clearly stated that there's no military solution in Iraq, and that he did not intend to engage militarily in Iraq. So this operation at this point is targeted, it's limited, but it can't go any further. And I think that the American people must be vigilant, because there's always the risk that there could be a rationale for it to spread. And so we're saying that the president must come to Congress if, in fact, the mission changes.
Right, and you're speaking to that relationship between supporting something that may have a good goal, but also being clear up front about the line. Let me ask the hard question, which is more a question, admittedly, for the president than for you at this juncture, Congresswoman. But given that rationale about genocide, if these airstrikes don't work, and then the genocide that has been predicted and discussed happens, is the position then of the White House, and is it the proper position that that should be allowed to happen because we don't want anything more than airstrikes?
Well, that's premature, and again, I'm glad you said that's for the White House to decide, but let me tell you what I think in terms of the protection of these, 50,000 people. One is the United Nations and the international community right now are talking about how to develop a humanitarian and evacuation corridor. We must support that and call on the world community to support this international evacuation corridor, and do this right away. Secondly, I think if the president intends to use combat troops, especially, or or expand the operation, it's essential that Congress be called back into session. And we debate that and talk about that, because no, we do not want to see anyone die and genocide occur as a result of what is taking place. ISIS is very dangerous, as the previous speaker, Howard Dean, and others have said. But we cannot engage militarily in this conflict and be drawn back into what unfortunately was a war without end, because we see now what is taking place. It's time that we recognize that the Iraqis need to come together, the region needs to come together, come up with some form of a regional stability program, process, diplomatic initiative, and try to get this and allow the Iraqis to develop their solutions moving forward and support that effort. But in no way should we be there for the long run militarily.
And just briefly, the other line from a perspective of limiting this beyond the ground operation piece is other types of airstrikes. Senator Graham now saying this doesn't go far enough unless we also do at least airstrikes in Syria. Briefly, your response.
Well, I say that's what mission creep is all about. That's expanding the United States' role militarily in the region, which the American people, quite frankly, do not want to see happen. We have got to figure out a strategy that's going to allow for the end of this conflict with our support, but not engage militarily. It's tough, yes, but I tell you, we cannot go down this road again. We did it in Afghanistan. We did it in Iraq. We lost thousands of our brave young men and women. Our national treasury is lost to the tune of $1 trillion or so. So we must figure this out in a way that makes sense, that does not engage the United States in military combat operation anymore.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you for your views and your time tonight.
Thank you.
Now, after efforts to extend a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas failed, today the violence there resumed. Another big story that we have been watching. Where do things go from here? That's straight ahead.